Step away from the patient, now.
I'm the cardiac surgeon. This patient is coding.
I don't care what you claim to be. Security called about someone suspicious in scrubs.
Check my ID badge. I'm Dr. James Morrison, Chief of Cardiothoracic.
You're coming with me.
Officer Brian Hutchinson's body cam captured the exact moment he physically blocked the entrance to St. Michael's Hospital's surgery corridor at 11:41 p.m. on a Wednesday night, preventing a black man in full surgical scrubs from passing, demanding identification and explanation for why he was in that restricted hospital area. The man was Dr. Raymond Carter, chief cardiac surgeon with 23 years of experience, who had just completed 7-hour emergency bypass surgery and was trying to reach the recovery room to check on his patient whose post-operative condition was critical and required constant medical monitoring. Dr. Carter was wearing full scrubs marked with hospital logo, had hospital identification badge clearly visible hanging from his neck, showing his photo, name, and title, Chief Cardiac Surgeon, and was carrying medical tablet with patient records only authorized hospital personnel would have access to. But to Officer Hutchinson, who had been called to hospital for unrelated report and was patrolling corridors without adequate supervision from hospital staff, the sight of a black man in restricted area apparently was sufficient reason to assume unauthorized presence and potential security threat. What happened in the next 18 minutes, all documented by Hutchinson's body cam and hospital security cameras from multiple angles, would become one of the most embarrassing examples of racial profiling in healthcare setting, an incident costing police department and hospital dearly in terms of financial settlements, public trust, and forced reforms. Before diving into this story showing exactly what happens when casual racism meets medical emergency where every second matters, tell me, where are you watching from? If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and leave a comment about what you think should happen when officers interfere with medical professionals trying to save lives, because this story will give you perfect example of why training on recognizing implicit bias is absolutely essential in every profession. Dr. Raymond Carter was 51 years old and at absolute top of his profession. He had graduated cum laude from Harvard Medical School, completed prestigious residency in cardiac surgery at Johns Hopkins, and served as cardiac surgeon at St. Michael's for 17 years, the last 8 as chief surgeon overseeing entire cardiovascular surgery department. He had performed over 3,000 open-heart surgeries in his career, his success rate among highest nationally, and he was regularly requested for particularly complex or high-risk cases where exceptional expertise was needed. Fellow physicians deeply respected him. Medical residents competed for opportunities to observe his surgeries and learn from his vast knowledge, and patients often traveled from neighboring states specifically to be treated by him because his reputation for surgical excellence had spread through medical referral networks. That specific evening, Dr. Carter had been in surgery since 4:30 p.m., working meticulously to repair severely blocked coronary arteries of 62-year-old patient named Thomas Brennan, who had been rushed to hospital by ambulance after massive heart attack. Surgery had been technically challenging, requiring multiple bypass grafts and repair of heart damage from attack, type of procedure only surgeon with Dr. Carter's extensive experience could successfully execute. Operation had gone well, but not without complications. There were moments where patients' blood pressure had dropped dangerously, and Dr. Carter had had to make split-second decisions, literally meaning difference between life and death. After 7 intense hours of microscopic concentration, absolutely steady hands and surgical skill coming from decades of training and experience, Dr. Carter had closed patient's chest and handed care to anesthesiology team for patient transfer to surgical intensive care unit. Standard protocol after high-complexity cardiac surgery required attending surgeon to check patient in recovery within first post-operative hour to ensure no bleeding, vital signs remain stable, and no immediate complications emerging from surgery stress. Dr. Carter had done this literally thousands of times in his career, walking from operating room through connecting corridors to surgical intensive care unit to check his patients. This was absolutely standard routine, essential part of responsible post-operative care, and something no conscientious surgeon would ever skip, especially after surgery as complex as what he'd just performed. He had changed from sterile surgical scrubs worn during operation to clean hospital scrubs, but kept surgical cap and mask because he was still technically in sterile environment and because he planned possibly returning to another emergency surgery if called. His identification badge was where it always was, clearly visible on lanyard around his neck. Officer Hutchinson had been dispatched to St. Michael's earlier that evening in response to report of possible fight in emergency department. Situation resolved by hospital security staff before Hutchinson arrived. Instead of simply leaving facility after confirming his assistance was no longer needed, Hutchinson had decided to patrol hospital corridors, apparently thinking he was providing additional security service, but actually operating outside his appropriate scope, and without adequate coordination with hospital security staff who knew personnel and protocols. He had wandered into restricted areas of hospital, where only medical staff with appropriate credentials had access. Areas clearly marked with signs indicating only authorized personnel could enter. It was in one of these restricted corridors, corridor connecting operating rooms with intensive care unit, that Hutchinson saw Dr. Carter walking toward him. Hutchinson's body cam captured his perspective as he saw Dr. Carter approaching in corridor. Dr. Carter was walking purposefully but not running, his medical tablet in one hand, his other hand adjusting surgical mask that had slipped slightly. He was obviously medical professional based on his attire, his demeanor, and context of being in restricted hospital area where only medical staff would work. But instead of simply greeting fellow professional, doing his work, or, if genuinely unsure about someone's authorization, politely asking if he could help with something, Hutchinson took position completely blocking corridor and assumed authoritative posture, immediately signaling he saw Dr. Carter as suspect, rather than medical professional doing critical life-saving work. He called out to Dr. Carter in loud voice, echoing through silent hospital corridor, asking where he was going and what he was doing in that area. Dr. Carter stopped, clearly surprised to be challenged in his own hospital, an area where he worked daily, but responded politely because he'd learned through decades as black man in America, especially black man in positions of professional authority, that safest way to handle law enforcement figures was to remain calm, respectful, and clear in communication even when encounters seemed unjustified or based on racial assumptions. He told Hutchinson he was cardiac surgeon, going to check post-operative patient in intensive care unit. Standard medical routine, he briefly explained, because he wanted to ensure Hutchinson understood this wasn't something unusual or suspicious, but normal part of medical care. He pointed to his visible identification badge and offered to show it more closely if Hutchinson needed to verify his credentials. Reasonable approach that should have ended entire interaction in literally 15 seconds. But Hutchinson didn't accept that reasonable explanation or look at the identification badge Dr. Carter was offering to show. Instead, he said he needed to see proper identification and verify with hospital security that Dr. Carter really had authorization to be in that area. The body cam captured the moment of confusion passing across Dr. Carter's face, visible even above his surgical mask, as he processed he was being treated like an intruder in hospital, where he'd worked for nearly 2 decades, and where his name was literally listed on wall plaque in surgery department as chief surgeon. Dr. Carter maintained his composure and responded his hospital ID badge was proper identification, that it was clearly visible, and that he really needed to check his patient whose post-surgical condition was time-sensitive. He explained in simple terms, patient had just come out of emergency cardiac surgery, and delays in post-operative check could literally mean difference between life and death if complications were developing. Hutchinson responded saying, anyone could obtain hospital uniform and fake badge, a statement revealing both deep ignorance about hospital security protocols and willingness to assume black man in scrubs was more likely criminal with falsified identity than legitimate doctor. Dr. Carter felt familiar anger rising, but pushed it down because he knew showing frustration with law enforcement figure, especially as black man, could dangerously escalate situation. He responded calmly. His badge had RFID chip, granting access to hospital restricted areas, that security cameras throughout corridor would show him working there regularly, and any hospital security staff member or any passing nurse or doctor could verify his identity instantly. He also mentioned he was carrying medical tablet with patient records only authorized physicians would have access to, offering to show that too if it helped establish his credentials. Dr. Carter's reasonable offer of multiple forms of verification should have resolved situation. but Hutchinson seemed to interpret Dr. Carter's cooperation as some kind of suspicious manipulation. He ordered Dr. Carter to put tablet on ground and put hands where he could see them, language typically used when officer considers someone potential threat and wants to ensure they're not reaching for weapon or dangerous device. Dr. Carter was visibly shocked at escalation, but complied because he knew stories of numerous black men injured or killed by officers claiming to feel threatened. He carefully placed medical tablet on floor and raised both hands. Submissive posture, painfully ironic, given these were hands having saved hundreds of lives over distinguished career. Bodycam captured entire exchange, documenting how routine encounter had transformed into something much more sinister, based apparently solely on Dr. Carter's race, because no aspect of his behavior or appearance suggested threat or criminal conduct. It was at this point nurse coming off night shift appeared in corridor behind Dr. Carter, young woman named Sarah Mitchell, who had worked with Dr. Carter on numerous surgeries and knew him well. She saw Dr. Carter standing with hands raised, saw Hutchinson in confrontational posture, and immediately understood something was terribly wrong. Sarah approached quickly, her voice raised with mixture of disbelief and indignation, as she asked Officer Hutchinson why he was detaining the chief cardiac surgeon. Bodycam captured Hutchinson's reaction, slight hesitation suggesting he was beginning to realize he might have made a mistake, but instead of backing down or apologizing, he doubled down on his authority. He told Sarah he was conducting security check, and she should not interfere with police investigation. Sarah wasn't intimidated. Her experience of years working in hospital environment had taught her to advocate for herself and others when necessary, especially when seeing obvious injustice happening. Sarah turned to Dr. Carter and asked loudly enough for Bodycam to clearly capture if he was okay, and if he needed her to call hospital security or administration. Dr. Carter calmly responded. He appreciated her concern, but was handling situation, though he did need to check Mr. Brennan urgently because post-operative time was extending beyond what was ideal for first medical check. Sarah then did something crucial for subsequent litigation. She pulled out her own phone and began recording video of interaction, explaining aloud she was documenting to ensure there was independent record of what was happening. Mention of additional recording made Hutchinson visibly uncomfortable, and he ordered Sarah to turn off her phone and leave area. Sarah politely but firmly refused, saying she had every right to record in public hospital space, and as registered nurse, she had obligation to advocate for patient safety being potentially compromised by this unnecessary delay of his surgeon. Sarah's arrival and her vocal defense of Dr. Carter changed situation dynamics. Hutchinson was no longer dealing with an isolated black man he could intimidate into silence, but now there was witness clearly knowing Dr. Carter and documenting Hutchinson's behavior. Hutchinson radioed for hospital security, requesting someone come to surgery corridor to verify identity of person he was detaining. The word detaining made Dr. Carter and Sarah exchange looks, because it transformed what had begun as questionable ID check into something more serious. Actual detention, implying Dr. Carter was being treated as criminal suspect. Dr. Carter asked Hutchinson directly if he was being detained, and if so, under what suspicion or charge. Hutchinson responded vaguely he was checking possible unauthorized access to hospital restricted area, accusation absurd given Dr. Carter's visible identification badge, his hospital scrubs, and witness confirming his identity. It took approximately 5 minutes for hospital security team member to arrive, 5 minutes during which Dr. Carter remained standing in corridor with hands still partially raised to avoid giving Hutchinson any excuse to escalate further. 5 minutes during which his patient in intensive care unit was without surgeon check medical protocol required. 5 minutes feeling like eternity, both for Dr. Carter and Sarah continuing to film entire interaction. When security guard finally arrived, middle-aged man named Frank Rodriguez, who had worked at hospital 12 years, his reaction seeing Dr. Carter was immediate shock and confusion. Frank knew Dr. Carter well, had greeted him literally hundreds of times over years, and had watched him transform cardiac surgery department into one of region's most respected programs. Frank looked from Dr. Carter to Hutchinson and asked why officer was detaining chief surgeon. Hutchinson's expression visibly changed when Frank identified Dr. Carter as a chief surgeon, finally realizing the magnitude of his error. But instead of immediately apologizing and allowing Dr. Carter to continue checking his critical patient, Hutchinson tried to justify his actions, saying he was just following security procedures and had no way of knowing who was who in hospital. Frank responded with mixture of disbelief and frustration, pointing to Dr. Carter's clearly visible identification badge and asking how anyone could not recognize official hospital credential with photo, name, and title. Frank also mentioned hospital security cameras captured everything, and this entire interaction would be reviewed by administration. Comment-making, Hutchinson realized his actions were being documented not just by his body cam and Sarah's phone, but also by hospital's comprehensive surveillance system covering every corridor. Dr. Carter finally said in firm but controlled voice he'd been extremely patient, had provided all reasonable identification requested, and was now 15 minutes late for critical post-operative check of patient who could be experiencing complications every minute of delay made more dangerous. He informed Hutchinson if anything happened to his patient, because of this unjustified delay, there would be serious legal and medical consequences. He then politely but firmly said he was continuing to intensive care unit to care for his patient, and if Hutchinson wanted to physically detain him, then he'd have to do so with force because Dr. Carter wasn't standing still one additional minute while his patient needed him. Body cam captured that moment of Dr. Carter reclaiming his professional authority and dignity, refusing to be further intimidated by officer, clearly exceeding any reasonable authority. Hutchinson, confronted with hospital security guard, confirming Dr. Carter's identity, nurse filming and witnessing, and Dr. Carter himself now assertively, declaring his intention to continue with medical duties, finally backed down. He mumbled something about just doing his job and ensuring hospital security, weak excuse not addressing obvious racial profiling, motivating initial stop or fact. He'd escalated routine situation into something much more serious through his refusal to accept legitimate identification and hospital employee testimony. Dr. Carter didn't respond to Hutchinson's non-apology apology, simply picked up his medical tablet from floor where he'd been forced to place it, nodded thanks to Sarah and Frank, and continued quickly toward intensive care unit where his patient waited. Sarah followed behind him for a moment, her phone still recording, capturing Dr. Carter, adjusting his scrubs, and clearly trying to recompose himself after humiliating confrontation so he could enter patient room with professional focus medical situation required. When Dr. Carter finally reached Thomas Brennan's room, almost 20 minutes after, when he should have made his first post-operative check, he found nursing staff anxiously monitoring patients' vital signs. One of nurses, 20-year veteran named Patricia Wong, expressed relief seeing him and reported Mr. Brennan's blood pressure had been fluctuating concerningly, and she'd been about to page another surgeon because protocols required immediate medical attention when vital signs showed instability. Dr. Carter examined patient quickly but thoroughly, his training and experience allowing assessment in minutes. He identified beginning of minor internal bleeding, causing blood pressure fluctuations, complication not uncommon after complex cardiac surgery, but requiring immediate intervention. If that bleeding had continued undetected another 20 or 30 minutes, it could have become life-threatening emergency, requiring additional emergency surgery. Dr. Carter ordered appropriate medications and adjusted monitoring protocols, interventions stabilizing Mr. Brennan's condition within 15 minutes. But while working to save his patient from potentially fatal complication, part of his mind was processing what had just happened in corridor, humiliation of being stopped in his own hospital, frustration of having his time stolen when patient needed him, anger at being racially profiled in an environment where his expertise and position should have been immediately recognized and respected. Patricia noticed tension in his shoulders, way his jaw was clenched even while speaking calmly to Mr. Brennan, beginning to wake from anesthesia. She asked discreetly if he was okay, and Dr. Carter responded he'd discuss later, but now needed to focus on patient. That ability to compartmentalize personal trauma to focus on patient care was mark of exceptional medical professional, but didn't make trauma less real or less harmful. After stabilizing Mr. Brennan and ensuring nursing staff had clear instructions for continued monitoring, Dr. Carter left intensive care unit. and went directly to hospital administration office despite late hour. He knew night administrator would be on duty, and this incident needed immediate reporting, while fresh and while witnesses were available and recordings accessible. Night administrator, man named David Chen, knowing Dr. Carter from collaboration on numerous hospital matters over years, was visibly shocked when Dr. Carter reported what happened. David immediately began reviewing hospital security camera recordings, finding multiple angles of interaction between Dr. Carter and Hutchinson, corroborating exactly what Dr. Carter described. Recordings clearly showed Dr. Carter in full hospital scrubs with visible identification badge, showed Hutchinson blocking his path without apparent cause, showed Dr. Carter cooperating completely while trying to explain urgent patient situation. David also pulled access records showing Dr. Carter's RFID badge being used to enter restricted area where confrontation occurred. Additional electronic proof he had complete authorization to be there. David expressed deep apologies on hospital's behalf and assured Dr. Carter this incident would be treated with maximum seriousness, that police department would be formally contacted about Hutchinson's behavior, and hospital would take steps to ensure this type of interference with medical staff performing critical patient care never happened again. Dr. Carter appreciated David's assurances, but made clear he expected more than just words. He wanted concrete policy changes, ensuring medical staff, particularly medical staff of color, wouldn't be subjected to racial profiling or harassment while trying to do their life-saving work. He also mentioned he'd be consulting with his own lawyers about possible legal action, not because he wanted to sue hospital, but because he wanted to ensure real accountability and systemic reforms. The news of incident spread through hospital with remarkable speed. By next morning, virtually entire medical and nursing staff at St. Michael's had heard about chief cardiac surgeon being stopped and questioned by police officer while trying to check critical post-operative patient. Reaction among hospital personnel was uniform outrage, with doctors and nurses from all departments expressing shock such thing could happen in their own institution. Several medical staff members, particularly doctors and nurses of color, shared their own experiences of being questioned or treated with suspicion in hospital despite wearing scrubs and identification badges. Revealing what happened to Dr. Carter was an isolated incident, but symptom of broader problem of how people of color were perceived, even in professional environments where their credentials were clearly visible. Those conversations spread beyond informal channels and transformed into formal demands for all staff meeting to address issues of racial discrimination and patient safety. Hospital President Dr. Margaret Sullivan convened emergency executive board meeting for that afternoon, recognizing this incident had potential to become both public relations scandal and serious legal matter. Margaret had worked with Dr. Carter for over a decade and respected him immensely both as surgeon and colleague, and she was genuinely horrified he'd been subjected to such treatment. But beyond personal concern for Dr. Carter, she also understood broader institutional implications. If hospital's chief surgeon could be stopped and detained by police officer while trying to provide emergency medical care, then no staff member was safe from similar interference. And more importantly, patient safety was being compromised when doctors were prevented from reaching patients needing urgent attention. Board meeting resulted in unanimous decision to completely review hospital security protocols, particularly how external law enforcement interacted with hospital spaces and medical staff. Meanwhile, police department initiated its own investigation after David Chen filed formal complaint about Hutchinson's behavior. Captain responsible for supervising Hutchinson, 28-year veteran named Robert Martinez, reviewed Hutchinson's body cam and was visibly disturbed by what he saw. Recording clearly showed Hutchinson escalating routine situation into prolonged confrontation, despite Dr. Carter providing adequate identification and reasonable explanation for his presence in restricted area. Martinez also noted Hutchinson had failed to follow basic de-escalation procedures, hadn't consulted with hospital security staff before confronting Dr. Carter, and hadn't shown any willingness to accept identity verification from hospital employee knowing Dr. Carter. Each of these failures represent a deviation from standard training and departmental policies on how to conduct security checks on private property like hospital. Investigation revealed additional information, making Hutchinson's behavior even more problematic. Records showed Hutchinson had received 3 previous informal complaints over 2 years about overly aggressive treatment of black citizens during routine stops. Complaints filed away without formal investigation because none had resulted in physical force use or arrest. Pattern of those complaints, all involving black citizens in situations where Hutchinson had questioned their presence in locations where they had every right to be. Suggested racial profiling problem department had failed to adequately address. One previous incident had involved black university professor Hutchinson had stopped on college campus and questioned about why he was in classroom building, despite professor carrying briefcase full of class documents and wearing faculty identification badge. That previous complaint echoed Dr. Carter's incident so closely, it made impossible to argue Dr. Carter's stop was isolated. Judgment error rather than manifestation of deeper biases. Dr. Carter consulted with law firm specializing in civil rights and discrimination, firm having successfully represented numerous clients in cases against law enforcement and medical institutions. Lawyers, led by experienced attorney named Jennifer Washington, having litigated several high-profile racial discrimination workplace cases, reviewed all evidence including Hutchinson's body cam, Sarah's phone recording, multiple hospital security camera recordings, and witness statements. Jennifer gave assessment. This was extraordinarily strong case both against police department for racial profiling and interference with medical duties and potentially against hospital if it could be demonstrated inadequate security policies allowed external officer to interrupt critical patient care. Firm recommended dual approach of seeking settlement through negotiation while also preparing comprehensive civil lawsuit if settlement couldn't be reached. Broader medical community began taking notice of incident when story appeared in State Medical Association newsletter, sparking discussions about physicians' rights to perform their functions without interference in particular issues faced by physicians of color, frequently confronting assumptions they don't belong in professional spaces. National Medical Association, organization representing black physicians across country, issued statement condemning Dr. Carter's treatment and drawing attention to broader systemic problem of racial profiling in medicine, where doctors, nurses, and other healthcare professionals of color are routinely questioned about their credentials or treated with suspicion by patients, patient families, and even colleagues and security personnel. Statement cited statistics showing black medical professionals report being mistaken for housekeeping, staff, assistants, or even unauthorized visitors at significantly higher rates than white colleagues, even when wearing clear identification marking them as doctors. Sarah Mitchell, nurse who had intervened and recorded part of incident, became vocal advocate within hospital for better protection of staff of color against discrimination. She shared her phone recording widely with hospital administration and also made it available to Dr. Carter's lawyers, recognizing her testimony, and documentation would be crucial for ensuring accountability. Sarah also began collecting stories from other staff members of color having experienced similar treatment. Creating record of incidents demonstrating problem at St. Michael's wasn't isolated to one officer on one night, but pattern of systemic failures to protect diverse staff from prejudice and discrimination. That documentation work would be instrumental in forcing hospital to confront its own policy and culture failures, allowing external officer to interrupt chief surgeon without any verification or adequate supervision from hospital personnel, knowing who Dr. Carter was and could have resolved entire situation in seconds. Civil lawsuit was formally filed 3 months after incident, meticulously constructed legal document of 132 pages that would eventually be studied in law school programs as example of how to litigate racial discrimination, case in healthcare context. Petition named Officer Hutchinson individually, police department, city, and surprisingly also, St. Michael's Hospital as defendants, arguing each entity had contributed to violation of Dr. Carter's rights in distinct but interconnected ways. Hutchinson was charged with racial profiling, unlawful detention, and interference with emergency medical duties. Police department was charged with failure to adequately train and supervise, especially on issues of implicit racial bias and appropriate protocols for interacting with medical professionals in healthcare facilities. Hospital was included for failure to implement adequate protections, ensuring authorized medical staff wouldn't be prevented from reaching critical patients. by external security personnel, thus creating patient safety risks, violating medical care standards. Hospital's inclusion as defendant was strategic and also reflected Dr. Carter's genuine concern inadequate hospital policies had allowed situation to happen. Jennifer Washington explained, while Dr. Carter didn't want to harm institution where he'd worked so many years, he strongly believed hospital had responsibility to protect its medical staff from interference compromising patient care and failure to have clear protocols on how external law enforcement should or shouldn't interact with medical staff in restricted areas represented institutional negligence needing address. Petition sought $3,200,000 in compensatory and punitive damages, but more importantly, sought injunctive relief requiring both police department and hospital implement comprehensive reforms to prevent similar future incidents. Dr. Carter made clear to his lawyers money wasn't his. Primary motivation, he wanted systemic change benefiting all medical professionals of color and protecting patients from having their care interrupted by racial discrimination. Defendants' responses varied significantly in tone and substance. Hutchinson and police department initially tried defending their actions, arguing officer had followed reasonable security procedures when verifying identity of person in hospital restricted area. But that defense quickly crumbled when confronted with video evidence showing Dr. Carter clearly dressed in hospital scrubs, with visible identification badge, cooperating fully, and repeatedly explaining urgent patient situation. Defense attorneys also had to contend with history of previous complaints against Hutchinson, showing pattern of treating black citizens with excessive suspicion in situations where white citizens likely wouldn't have been questioned. St. Michael's Hospital adopted different approach, issuing public apology to Dr. Carter almost immediately and acknowledging hospital policies had been inadequate for protecting medical staff from unauthorized interference with their critical patient care duties. Discovery in case revealed more information damaging to law enforcement defendants. Internal emails showed supervisors and police department had been alerted about Hutchinson's problematic behavior in previous incidents, but had chosen simply to give verbal warnings instead of sending him for racial sensitivity training or formal supervision. One particularly revealing memo from 2 years earlier discussed concerns Hutchinson may have problem recognizing when behavior is guided by racial assumptions rather than legitimate safety concerns. But recommendation for additional training had been rejected due to budget constraints and unwillingness to create formal record that could be used against department in future litigation. That evidence of deliberate indifference to warning signs about racial profiling would be devastating for department's attempts to argue they had no prior knowledge of problem. Hutchinson's deposition was disaster for law enforcement defense. Confronted with video recordings from multiple angles and asked specifically what about Dr. Carter had made him seem suspicious, Hutchinson struggled to articulate any concrete reason beyond vague statement. Not everyone in scrubs is really a doctor, and he was just being cautious. When pressed about why he hadn't simply looked at Dr. Carter's clearly visible identification badge or accepted verification from Nurse Sarah, knowing Dr. Carter, Hutchinson became defensive and evasive. When Jennifer Washington asked whether he would have stopped and detained white surgeon in same exact circumstances, Hutchinson claimed race had nothing to do with his decisions, but his inability to provide any behavior-based justification for initial stop made that denial unconvincing. Deposition also revealed Hutchinson didn't even know hospital. Policies on how external security personnel should coordinate with internal security staff before confronting hospital employees, demonstrating he'd operated outside appropriate protocols. Dr. Carter was also deposed, and his testimony provided powerful contrast with Hutchinson's evasive account. Dr. Carter calmly and precisely described every moment of encounter, explaining how he'd provided all reasonable identification, how he'd tried to communicate urgency of patient situation, and how he'd been forced to choose between continuing to assert his rights as person, having done nothing wrong, versus yielding to officer, illegally preventing him from reaching critical patient. He testified about emotional impact of being treated as criminal suspect in his own workplace, where he dedicated over 20 years to saving lives, and about additional trauma of knowing his patient had been in danger during those 20 minutes when he was being unnecessarily detained. Most poignantly, he testified about conversations he had had since incident with young medical residents of color, asking if they too would be treated this way even after years of training and establishing themselves in their careers, revealing how incident had sent ripples through broader medical community and undermined confidence of next generation of physicians of color. Thomas Brennan, patient whose post-operative check had been delayed due to Dr. Carter's detention, also provided powerful testimony. He testified about waking in recovery and hearing nurses worriedly discussing his fluctuating vital signs, about feeling frightened not knowing what was happening with his body after major heart surgery, and about tremendous relief when Dr. Carter finally arrived and quickly identified and treated bleeding complication. When defense lawyers tried arguing delay hadn't really harmed Mr. Brennan because he survived and recovered, he responded emotionally. He'd been terrified during those minutes when nurses seemed worried, but his surgeon was absent, and he later learned that delay had been caused by police officers stopping Dr. Carter without legitimate reason. His testimony humanized consequences of Hutchinson's actions in ways making impossible for potential jury to see this as merely procedural dispute about procedures. This was about real patient whose life had been at risk because of racial profiling. The case was resolved through comprehensive settlement 14 months after incident. Settlement representing significant victory, not just for Dr. Carter, but for medical professionals of color across country facing similar discrimination. City agreed to pay Dr. Carter $1,800,000 in damages, recognizing both severity of racial profiling and unlawful detention. In fact, Hutchinson's actions had endangered patient life by delaying critical medical care. St. Michael's Hospital contributed additional $500,000 as part of separate settlement, acknowledging inadequate security policies had failed to protect medical staff from unauthorized interference. But, as in previous cases Dr. Carter had observed as civil rights advocate, money wasn't the most important part of settlement. Mandated structural reforms would transform how both police department and hospital operated and establish precedent other institutions across country would eventually follow. Hutchinson was permanently terminated from police department and his law enforcement certification revoked after internal affairs. Investigation concluded he'd violated multiple departmental policies, including conducting detention without reasonable cause grounded in articulable facts, failing to de-escalate situation when provided with identification and reasonable explanation, and demonstrating pattern of unequal treatment of black citizens as evidenced by previous complaints department had ignored. Termination sent message through law enforcement community, interfering with medical professionals. Performing life-saving care would have career consequences, especially when that interference was motivated by racial bias. Some law enforcement advocacy groups complained punishing Hutchinson so severely for what they characterized as error in judgment was excessive, but most commentators, including many in law enforcement, pointed out stopping chief surgeon in his own hospital while trying to reach critical patient was so obviously outside bounds of appropriate behavior, no reasonable defense was possible. Police department was required to implement comprehensive training program on implicit racial bias and appropriate interactions with medical professionals in healthcare facilities. Training had to be developed in consultation with civil rights organizations, medical associations representing physicians of color, and experts in racial discrimination in healthcare settings. Each officer had to complete 16 hours of initial training, followed by quarterly 4-hour updates, with curriculum including recognizing how unconscious bias influences perceptions and decision-making, understanding why professionals of color are disproportionately questioned about their credentials, even in their own institutions, and specific protocols on when and how officers should interact with medical professionals during emergencies. Training included Dr. Carter's case as central example of what not to do, with video recordings of incident shown and analyzed, frame by frame, to identify each point where Hutchinson could have made different decision, resulting in respectful resolution instead of humiliating confrontation. Settlement also established community review panel on policing and healthcare, independent body, composed of medical professionals, civil rights advocates, and community members with authority to review any future incidents involving law enforcement and healthcare professionals. Panel would have access to body cam recordings, a power to interview everyone involved, and authority to make binding recommendations on officer discipline and policy changes. 3 of 7 panel members had to be medical professionals of color to ensure perspectives of people most likely affected by racial profiling were centered in oversight process. Dr. Carter agreed to serve on panel for first year of operation, using his experience both as victim of discrimination and respected medical leader to help shape policies protecting healthcare professionals and patients from discriminatory interference. St. Michael's Hospital implemented its own extensive reforms as part of settlement. Hospital created Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, specifically focused on protecting staff of color from discrimination and ensuring all staff members could perform their duties without harassment or interference based on race. Hospital also completely revised its security protocols to make clear external law enforcement had no authority to stop or question hospital employees in restricted areas without first coordinating with hospital security supervisors who could verify employee identity and authorization. New procedures required any officer needing to enter hospital restricted areas for non-emergency reasons had to register with Central Hospital Security and be accompanied by hospital staff member who could make appropriate introductions and prevent misunderstandings. Hospital also implemented mandatory training for all staff on recognizing and reporting racial discrimination, with particular emphasis on empowering people to intervene when witnessing colleagues being treated unfairly. Extensive media coverage of case and settlement created national awareness of issue of racial profiling of medical professionals. Major medical organizations, including American Medical Association and National Medical Association, issued joint statements using Dr. Carter's case as example of why hospitals and law enforcement departments needed better policies protecting physicians of color from discrimination. Medical schools across country began incorporating discussions about navigating professional racism in their curricula, preparing future physicians of color for possibility. Their credentials might be questioned even after years of training and establishing successful careers. Some medical residency programs even began, including training on doctors' legal rights and how to document discrimination incidents if they occurred. Pragmatic recognition medical education needed to prepare students not just for clinical challenges, but for realities of practicing medicine while black or brown in America. Dr. Carter used significant portion of settlement money to establish scholarship fund for underrepresented minority medical students, particularly those interested in working in underserved communities where physicians of color were desperately needed, but where they might also face discrimination from patients, colleagues, or law enforcement. He also donated $500,000 to civil rights advocacy initiatives working to combat racial profiling in professional settings. In interviews about case, Dr. Carter always emphasized he'd had advantages most racial profiling victims didn't have: established position, witnesses willing to intervene, multiple video recordings, and resources to hire excellent lawyers. He pointed out countless other professionals of color experienced similar discrimination but never obtained justice because they lacked those advantages or were too early in careers to risk being seen as making waves by filing formal complaints. Thomas Brennan, patient whose life had been potentially endangered by delay in medical care, became unlikely advocate for reform settlement mandated. He wrote op-ed for local newspaper explaining, as white man, he'd never fully understood racial profiling until it directly affected his own medical care when surgeon trying to save his life was stopped because of his race. He testified at city council meetings supporting funding for training programs, settlement required, and urging other white citizens to recognize racial profiling wasn't just unfair to victims, but created public safety problems when interfering with professionals trying to do critical work. His testimony from perspective of white patient directly benefiting from black surgeons, expertise was powerful precisely because it came from someone outside communities, typically most affected by racial profiling. Sarah Mitchell, nurse who had intervened and documented incident, was promoted to leadership position in hospital's new Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, recognition of her courage in speaking up, and dedication to creating fairer environment for all hospital employees. She used that platform to implement mentorship programs connecting senior staff of color with younger employees who might be facing discrimination but hesitant to report. creating support networks making it less likely future incidents would be ignored or minimized. She also led development of confidential reporting system where employees could document discrimination experiences without fear of retaliation. Aggregated data from those reports used to identify patterns and develop targeted interventions. Frank Rodriguez, security guard, who had verified Dr. Carter's identity and helped resolve situation, became lead instructor for new hospital security training on recognizing and respecting medical staff of all races. He developed training protocols emphasizing security personnel had responsibility to protect hospital employees from external discrimination, not just protect hospital from external threats. His training included role-playing exercises where security guards practiced intervening when witnessing hospital employees being treated inappropriately, flipping security concept from protecting only physical property to also protecting dignity and safety of people working within that space. Community Review Panel on Policing and Healthcare reviewed 23 incidents in its first 2 years of operation, identifying patterns in how law enforcement interacted with medical professionals and making recommendations significantly improving coordination between police department and healthcare facilities. No incident similar to what happened with Dr. Carter occurred after new policies and training implementation, suggesting reforms really had created cultural change in how officers understood and respected authority and autonomy of medical professionals in healthcare settings. Panel also documented overall reduction in complaints about discriminatory treatment of healthcare professionals of color, indicating increased training and oversight were having positive impact. Dr. Carter continued practicing cardiac surgery at St. Michael's. His reputation strengthened by fact he hadn't just talked about justice but had pursued it personally when his own rights were violated. He became mentor for young medical residents of color, sharing his experience not to frighten them, but to prepare them for reality. Even established, highly respected physicians could face discrimination, and empower them with knowledge they had rights and resources if it happened to them. His mentorship sessions always included practical discussion about documenting incidents, knowing your rights, and finding allies who would intervene when witnessing unfair treatment. He emphasized fighting for justice wasn't about being contentious, but about ensuring institutions respected dignity of all professionals, regardless of race. Hutchinson tried appealing his termination and certification revocation, but all review panels watched video recordings and concluded his actions had been so clearly outside appropriate professional behavior, and so obviously motivated by racial bias, no amount of remedial training could correct fundamental judgment failures he'd demonstrated. He eventually left area and pursued work unrelated to law enforcement, his attempt to rebuild career permanently tarnished. By fact, any online search of his name revealed videos and news articles about him stopping chief cardiac surgeon while surgeon tried to save patient's life. Some years later, there were reports he'd found work in private security in different state, but his career in public law enforcement was definitively over. Appropriate end for someone demonstrating he didn't deserve public trust, coming with carrying badge. Dr. Carter's story transcended being just legal case or personal victory. It became narrative about resistance, about refusing to allow humiliation to pass without consequences, about transforming discrimination experience into force for systemic change benefiting others. It became about recognizing even people in positions of authority and extraordinary achievement weren't immune to racial profiling, but also about demonstrating accountability was possible when victims had courage to speak up, allies had courage to intervene, and evidence was documented so completely denial was impossible. Multiple video recordings of incident, Hutchinson's body cam, Sarah's phone, hospital security cameras were crucial for ensuring justice because they made impossible for defendants to spin facts or question Dr. Carter's credibility. Case became cited. Example in discussions about why body cams and hospital surveillance were essential accountability tools. 10 years after incident, researchers studying impact of racial justice interventions in healthcare settings contacted Dr. Carter for interview as part of longitudinal study. Researcher had analyzed data from St. Michael's Hospital and local police department and found reforms mandated by Dr. Carter's settlement had produced sustained improvements in how medical professionals of color were treated and how law enforcement interacted with healthcare facilities. There were no additional incidents of officers stopping medical professionals in hospital. Employee satisfaction surveys showed significant improvements in how staff of color felt valued and protected, and collaboration between hospital and police on legitimate security matters had actually improved because clear protocols eliminated ambiguity and misunderstandings. Dr. Carter expressed cautious hope progress was possible, but emphasized continuous vigilance was necessary because institutions could slip back into old practices if pressure and oversight decreased. Story became more than tale of injustice and correction. It became about power of standing firm, about importance of allies intervening, about need to document discrimination because memory and verbal testimony alone often weren't enough against institutional narratives. It became about understanding racial profiling was a systemic problem requiring systemic solutions, not just punishing individuals, but reforming policies, training, and cultures allowing discrimination to flourish. And it became about hope change was possible when victims refused silence, when institutions were forced to confront their failures, and when settlements included not just money, but real reforms, ensuring future generations of professionals of color wouldn't experience same injustice. $1,800,000 made headlines. But true legacy were policies, still protecting medical professionals years later, still ensuring patient care wouldn't be interrupted by racial discrimination, and still serving as model for other institutions trying to do better.